All right, guys. Guess what we're talking about? I'm just gonna say, like, you guys. I mean, they could just teach us at this point, right? I mean, they're just shouting it out. They're ready. They're ready for it. Victoria said, "Give me the mic. I got this." I don't hear you. Oh, there it is. There it is. All right.
Perfect.
Well,
you want me to start off?
Go for it.
Okay.
Let's talk about this.
So a lot of you have already been a part of this, but we've been going through over the past 8 weeks now this series called Hot Topics. And the whole thing was we wanted to start off this conversation of all these different types of topics that you guys are facing in the culture that you're living in, maybe in the schools that you're a part of or your friend groups that you're a part of. And so we wanted to start answering hard things like depression, like anxiety, like identity, or technology and how we have that play in our lives. Or last time was Ryan talking on sexual identity. So all of these different things are so prevalent in your culture that you're growing up in. And so for us, we wanted this week to wrap up the entire series talking about this conversation of sex. And we're going to go ahead and say this. We can all embrace the awkwardness of it, and then it's going to be okay. Okay? So you can take a breath and then be okay with it. Because the reality is if we don't talk about it here, you're going to have it talked about in your culture. If we don't talk about it here from a biblical standpoint, you're going to hear it from a worldly standpoint. And so if we don't talk about it, you're missing out on, honestly, what I believe to be some of the coolest things about sex possible. And that's what I'm going to say. So that's going to be our starting into it. So we're going to jump in first by sharing us this last week. So we actually flew into Las Vegas to go travel up to Utah and go to Zion National Park. But it's an interesting thing that we started off by this week talking about this topic when we flew into Las Vegas. And why, Bri?
Well, and it wasn't planned that way, that the trip was going to be when the trip was, and this topic was already scheduled months ago. But it's really ironic. How many of you guys have heard something about Las Vegas before? Maybe?
It's got a lot of different phrases.
It has a lot of different reputations, a lot of different phrases. So let me just throw some of those out there. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That's a big one.
I didn't know that it's along with my dignity, though.
And some people add on to it, along with my dignity. Another one, Vegas is the answer, no matter the question. Okay, that's another one.
This one you laughed about.
This is my personal favorite.
Okay.
My personal favorite. Good girls go to heaven. Bad girls go to Vegas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Or also known as Sin City. Mm-hmm. Or honestly, the mantra of that area is whatever goes. Mm-hmm. Whatever you feel like, that's what it goes. Yeah. So it's interesting as we've gone through that, kind of flying into there, because we were laughing about the fact that in that culture, it's okay, sex, it doesn't matter. You can do it with whoever you want. And yet, the culture of that area is very similar to the culture of our entire country.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because in Vegas, you hear these statements in this culture. And I kid you not, okay, walking around Vegas, there's a whole lot of sex propaganda going on. I mean, we were walking down the street, there's a giant billboard that's promoting a nude club. And they're very proud of the fact that it's 100% nude. Whatever happens here, happens here. It's Vegas. It doesn't matter, right? The reality is, though, it's not just in Vegas that this happens. It's not just in Vegas that we see these things. And so it was an interesting experience. Thankfully, we were only in Vegas for 48 hours total, because that's where the airport was, flying in and flying out. But even being there for 48 hours, it was a huge reminder of what we face in our culture, in our societies, in our schools, in our communities, with our friends. There's a lot of these concepts that are being encouraged to us even today, even here, even in the Berrien County.
So honestly, the question, and if you haven't been a part of it, we ask a key question of all these different topics. And so tonight's topic question is sex worth waiting for? Is it? Because the reality is the culture that you live in will say that it's not. That at your age, it's fine. And so what we want to help cover is this big question: is sex worth waiting for? And so we're going to start off with asking the first question for this major question is, does the Bible actually say I shouldn't have sex? And I like how we phrase this, Bri, because I feel like it's a loaded question. And so how about I go ahead and I'll read the verses and then we can kind of jump in, okay? So we've got two different verses that we wanted to read from. One, Ephesians 5:3, which says this: "Let there be no sexual immorality, impurity, or greed among you. Such sins have no place among God's people." And then 1 Corinthians 6:18 through 20 also says this: "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does. For sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. And so don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. So you must honor God with your body."
So looking at that and reading through some of those verses, I mean, all throughout the Bible, there's a lot of different authors of the Bible who have addressed sex, who've addressed sex within marriage, sex outside of marriage. And there's a lot of verses. Anytime that sex is described in the Bible outside of a marital relationship, it's talked about as a sexual sin. It's talked about as something negative, something bad. And so the Bible does say don't have sex, but there's a context in which it says that. It says don't have sex outside of marriage. And so we have a couple statistics. First of all, I'll share one, that sex outside of marriage, it actually causes higher divorce rates within marriage. When you have sex before you're married or with other people than just your spouse, it actually contributes to higher divorce rates in our society. And one of the statistics that I saw today said that 25% of married Americans end in divorce. That's a quarter of all marriages.
So, I mean, honestly, guys, Bri said, like, it's a higher divorce rate, but also it's more likely to have actually affairs once in a marriage relationship. So even once you've decided, like, okay, I'm sticking to this person, sometimes people are less likely to stick with that person because it's like, well, I've had sex with a lot of other people, so why does it really matter now that I'm in this relationship to actually be only in this relationship when it comes to sex? And so, like, affairs tend to be higher in marriages that have had sex outside of the marriage. And then also, like, I wanted to read this. We wanted to apply a lot of science because the reality is it's really interesting because our culture says have sex whenever. It doesn't really matter. And yet, when it comes down to the science of what culture says, it actually shows that having sex inside of marriage only is better. And so, like, here's another thing that says more happens during sex than a momentary experience of pleasure. When you're intimate, chemicals are released into your brains that bond us together. Vasopressin is primarily released in a male's brain and oxytocin primarily in females. However, when you break, or bond, then break, we damage our capacity to bond strongly to the next person. It's similar to how, and I love this analogy, it's similar to how a sticky piece of tape is. The first time that you apply it to a surface, it bonds strongly. But if you take it off and reapply it to another surface, it's less adhesive. Soon it barely sticks at all after doing it over and over and over again.
So I'll help break that down again a little bit. The reality is when you have sex with someone, there is a chemical bond between those two people. And that's something that only God could design, only God created. That when you have sex, there's this chemical bond, a chemical relationship between those two people that you can't get any other way except through sex. But it's an amazing thing in the fact that God designed it to be so strong and so powerful that connects two people. But the more that you have that bond and then you break it, and then you rebond it to someone else, the less it bonds each time. So in theory, like you talk about Vegas, they're like, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, like do what you want. That's a horrible piece of advice Because the more people that you do that with, the less you're able to bond later in life when maybe you'd say it really matters.
But I would even go even further on that. Like, a lot of times friends will say, well, practice makes perfect. Like, the more that you have sex with people, then you're going to be able to perfect it, and it's going to be better later on when you get married. But the reality is, just like Bri is saying here, and what it says in this article, is that you are actually damaging those different bonds the further and further you go. And so, like, honestly, when you're in a relationship finally, and say it's a person that you're married to, now all of a sudden you have baggage that you're carrying. Whether you like it or not, you are carrying along all of these different relationships with you throughout your life.
And that chemical emotional bond that you had with that person, it doesn't disappear. You don't forget about that person. And so you may be married to your spouse in 15 years, but if you've had sex with 5 other people, you're also kind of still attached to those 5 other people, including to your spouse.
So first, the question of like whether sex, like, does the Bible say I shouldn't have sex? It's a yes and no answer. So the reality is culture, media, and your friends will tell you why it's better to have sex. They're going to tell you about the pleasure of it, that it's good, like you should just do it. But the reality is that while you're experiencing this peer pressure from like your peers, it actually is doing a lot of harm that you may not know, and you won't know until much later on. And so, like, first we would say, like, from what Scripture says. Actually, I'm not going to say this because I'm jumping ahead on it. So let me read a couple more passages. Okay?
You're just getting excited.
I'm getting excited. Okay. So let me go ahead and read Mark 10, 6 through 9. And it says this: "But God made them male and female from the beginning of creation. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together." In Genesis 2:24 is also reiterating this, and it says, "This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one." See, the reality is, inside of marriage, the Bible is saying that sex is very good. And so, like, we want you guys to hear tonight, it's not that sex is bad. It's not. And I think that sometimes the church in the past has said that sex is bad, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then all of a sudden you're married and it's like, okay, then it's okay. But what I want you guys to hear tonight is it is okay. It is good. But the context in which it happens is the most crucial part. The context is what makes it good or bad. And so that kind of leads us to this our relationship. And so, Bri, kind of just describe our relationship like prior to us actually starting to date.
It's hard to even remember back that far. But this is me and Brad the day after we started dating. So that was back in 2015. That was 6 years ago, 6.5-ish, something like that. So I think it was about 6.5 years ago we started dating. And there's a lot I could say. There was a lot of friends that I had that were dating at that time, and their dating relationships looked a lot different than ours. And a lot of my friends didn't understand why my dating relationship looked different. But here's the interesting thing. I went to a Christian high school. So in theory, we all should have had relationships that looked pretty similar, and yet mine looked very, very different from any of my friends' dating relationships. One of the largest parts of that being that when Brad and I first started dating, we laid out our boundaries. And we said, number one, we're not having sex until we're married. Out of my whole group of friends, out of at least 10 girls, I was the one that actually waited until I was married. And that was girls that went to youth group with me, that went to a Christian high school with me, that went through the same sex ed classes that I did. I was 10% of the girls.
And then on the flip side for me, I was more public schooled. And so going into the high school at that point when we started our relationship, and even prior to that, I mean, I remember having the pressure from guys always asking me like, hey, have you banged her yet? Like, why aren't you waiting? Or like, why do you wait right now? Like, you should just go like have sex with her. And I remember experiencing that pressure. And it was hard in the moment when they're always asking. But like for me, I just kept saying, hey, I've made this like decision that I'm not going to have sex with Bri unless we get married. And I remember experiencing that pressure from them in that moment. And so we share that because I think it answers our next question. If sex is not necessarily bad, based on the context, then why is sex designed only for marriage? And so that is honestly the next question that we want to answer. And Bri, how about you go ahead and read the next passage for us, Proverbs 5:15 through 18.
So our next question is, why is sex designed only for marriage? That's the one on your slips right there. Why is sex designed only for marriage? Proverbs 5:15 through 18 says, drink water from your own well. Share your love only with your wife. Why spill the water of your springs in the streets, having sex with just anyone? You should reserve it for yourselves. Never share it with strangers. Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. And then 1 Corinthians 7 verse 5 says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourself more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control.
Okay, here's a shocker for all of you. But sex actually continues the human race.
Just let that sink in.
I know
Let
that's
that
really
sink in.
crazy for you to understand, but actually it continues the human race. If you didn't know,
We have a son.
yeah. So it continues the human race. You are all products of sex continuing the human race.
You're welcome. You're
Okay.
welcome.
So I'm glad that we started with that because that was like probably the deepest part we're going to go tonight. So
We can move on now. Whew,
Okay,
got
but
that one out of the way.
then the funny thing is Genesis 1:28 does state that. It says, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, and then fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and all the animals that scurry along the ground. And so it's even stated at the very beginning of the Bible, like the point of sex is also to help produce more children so that there's more generations to come. But then even going on that, like sex is honestly the greatest connection between a husband and a wife. Let me say that again. Sex is the greatest connection between a husband and a wife. And so this is why we're so passionate about talking about this.
And it goes back to talking about that chemical connection. That's one of the reasons that it's one of the strongest connections between a husband and wife, because it's the only thing in their relationship that literally has a chemical bond between two people.
Yep. And then even going further beyond that, not only does it have this great connection between a husband and a wife, but even more important than that, it actually, sex is a picture of our relationship with God. And I remember hearing this in high school, and I was kind of like, that seems really weird. Like, I don't know, like that's just kind of a weird thought to think like the picture of sex is actually a picture of my relationship with God. But Bri
always kinda
talked
grossed
about
me out
this
a little
because
bit.
Bri actually did a paper on this. And so go ahead and talk a little
Don't
bit.
make me sound weird
No,
now.
that's fine.
When I was in college, I took a class called The Theology of Sexuality. How many of you would like, yeah, I'll take that class, right? That was a very interesting class to take. It was an entire 16-week course that we basically talked about sex every single day. It was great. I was one of two people that were married in that class talking about sex every single day. That was an interesting class to be a part of. But one of the coolest things that I was able to study and learn in that class is the fact that that the Bible uses marriage as an illustration of God's relationship with his people. But then you also look at the fact that there's the strong bond in this relationship between a husband and a wife having sex. And so I always was a little weirded out, like, how does this all connect? How does the picture all fit together of God and us and sex and husbands, wives? Like, it just didn't make sense to me until I continued to study and research, and I eventually wrote a paper on my theology of sexuality and what I believe sex was. And I came to the conclusion that because of the strong bond that sex creates between two people, it is the strongest connection two humans can have together. It is. Scientifically speaking, it's the strongest connection that two people can have together. Now, God's connection with us is so strong and so powerful. There is nothing that we can use to illustrate or to explain God's passion and love for his people. And so, to me, the only thing that we experience that can even give us an idea of God's depth and his love and his connection with his people is the experience that we can have when we have sex. Because there's such a deep, intimate bond with a person that is so hard to break with that person that it helps give an illustration of just how deep God's bond goes with you and with me. And so it was going through that class that I was really able to understand that, no, it doesn't mean I'm having sex with God, okay? This isn't some pagan religion. No, we're not going there, okay? But having sex between a husband and wife creates such a deep chemical bond and such a deep emotional relationship between those two people that it's the closest example that we can comprehend of what God's depth and love might be for us.
And then also, like going off of that, sex also is an opportunity for you to humble yourself and serve the other person. And I think this is one of the things that culture has completely messed up. Because anytime that you see in a movie or a show or
music,
anything, it's all about how can it serve me? How can it make me feel good? And the problem with that is that it's actually the total opposite of that. That sex is actually designed to be, how can I serve the other person? How can I help care for them in the ways that they need to be cared for? And I'll be honest, the reality is if you can do that, honestly, that's when the sex is the best. And when you can be able to humble yourself before the other person. Ephesians 5:33 says, "So again I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husbands." These kind of things where you're able to say, you know what, I care so much for you, and I want to humble myself to be able to serve you. And so it's an opportunity for us to humble ourselves, but then also waiting actually and not having sex before you're married allows you to not have any comparisons in that relationship, in that marriage. That you're not in a sexual relationship with your spouse and you're looking back and going, well, you know, that experience with my husband actually isn't as good as the other person that I had sex with. Or on the vice versa, the wife isn't going, well, I've actually had better sex with another guy in the past, and it's not as good as my husband. There's no comparison games when you wait. And it makes it so much better in that relationship. And so honestly, like this now kind of brings Bri and I up to our relationship again when we were just a little bit older. And so we had been dating for a while now. I think it was about 2 years just before we got engaged. No. Is that correct? Okay, what was it?
We got married 2 weeks shy of dating for 2 years.
Okay.
So we got engaged after dating a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. And so kind of going forward from the point when Bri and I said, okay, we're just deciding like sex is not on the table unless we get married. Then getting to the point where we finally did get married, we were faithful to that commitment. We said that's not on the table. And so there was moments where it was hard. It wasn't easy. But we made that conscious decision between one another that we were going to wait. And so we did. And so that's kind of bringing us up to, I think, the final question, Bri. And so,
well, and I want to toss one other thing in. Yep. That's not even in my notes. I'm going off notes now. But the reality is, it's easy to talk about this and pretend like it's this picture perfect, you say no, and you get married, and then it's magical, and here you go. That's the end story. But the reality is, you're going to face days in your life where you're going to want to have sex before you're married. Most likely. Maybe a few of you won't, but most likely there's going to be a day in your life where you're going to go, man, I kind of want this. Okay, and there's probably going to be some of you in the room that are sitting here and you're like, this is gross. Can we please stop talking about this, okay? That's fine too, okay? There's a whole range of perspectives in the room. But the reality is, it's not that easy decision of saying, I'm just going to say no, and then I get married, and it's great. But instead, you're going to have days in your life where you are going to want it, or you're going to meet someone and they are the love of your life and you love them so much, and it's going to be hard to say no. And so I don't want to pretend that there wasn't ever a time that we were like, man, I wish. And yet we still made that conscious decision going, you know what, I know I want this, but I know it's so much better if I just hang on and if I just wait.
So then that kind of leads us into, if sex is designed for marriage, then is it actually worth waiting for? And so, Bri, actually, you go ahead and you start off this next part and just touch on what we're going to touch on.
Is sex really worth waiting for? Before we dive deep into answering that question from our own perspectives, I want to throw out a note, a comment, because statistically speaking, the amount of people that are in this room tonight, there are probably people in this room who have been very close to having sex or who have already had sex. And I'm not going to be naive and pretend that I don't know that or that I'm not aware of that. And so I want to first speak to you guys and say that we still love you. We still want you here. It doesn't change how we see you. And the best part of the whole story is the fact that God is full of grace and love and forgiveness and redemption. And so maybe you've made a decision and maybe you've taken your relationship that far, but it doesn't mean that you have to take it that far tomorrow night or next weekend. It means that you can say, you know what? I do want to hang on. I do want to wait. I don't want to do this now. And that makes you strong to say no now. And it's sometimes even harder to say no once you've already said yes. But we want to encourage you that if you're like, you know what, I really do want to wait, that is what I want for myself, then wait. And it doesn't mean that you can't wait now because you didn't wait before. Because like we used the tape analogy, it doesn't mean that that piece of tape is never going to stick again. But the more times that you stick and unstick that tape, the less sticky it'll be at the very end. And so the sooner that you can stop playing around with that piece of tape, the better it's going to stick forever later. So that's kind of our note and our little like side thing. That if you're sitting here tonight and you're like, man, I've already taken it that far. I guess I'm done. I'm messed up. Like, there's no hope for me after that. That's not true. And if you think you're hearing that right now, I guarantee you that's Satan. Because the reality is God is 100% a God of love and forgiveness and redemption and grace. And I'd be lying if I told you that God hasn't given me a whole lot of forgiveness and grace that I don't deserve. And so you guys sitting here are also able to accept that grace and that love and that forgiveness from God.
And then if you're sitting here tonight and you're going, okay, like I've never had sex before, and like I'm still at that point where I'm asking, okay, is it worth it? The short answer is yes, it's worth it. See, like when we talked about just earlier, like all the negatives that can come from a relationship that is having sex outside of marriage, all of those negatives inside of marriage actually become positives. That actually now, all of a sudden, when you are able to use sex inside of marriage, it's now all of a sudden something that's bonding, something that's uniting for you, and that is able to help your relationship grow so much more than it ever thought possible. And so, like, if you're still here tonight and you're like, hey, I want to wait. I want to wait. Or maybe you're like, should I wait? Should I wait? Like, we want to say to you, it's worth waiting.
If no one else ever tells you, hear it tonight and hear it said, it's worth it. It's worth it to wait. It is so worth it. Because as soon as you leave this building tonight and you step back out into the culture and the community and you hear the radio, you hear the music, you watch a movie, you walk into school, you're going to hear every single person tell you, it's not worth waiting. But here's my fun tidbit. They didn't wait. If they're telling you it's not worth waiting, they didn't wait. So that they have no right to tell you that it's not worth it. because they've never been able to experience a marriage relationship that way, ever.
So this kind of like wraps up our story. And so for us, like, we waited until like we got married.
And we were a minority.
And we were. And honestly, I can tell you from us waiting, we continue even today, 5 years after we got married, like how glad we are that we did wait. That even when we experienced the pressure from our friends, that we said, you know what? Like, we're going to stick it out. We're going to stay faithful to what our like boundaries were. And now, like, we have friends that will come to us and say, you know, I'm married now and I'm happily married, but we kind of wish now that we would have waited as well. And it's not that their relationship now is unrepairable and they can't ever like have a great marriage, but they do have some regret. And so our desire is for you guys to not live with regret, to not live with like sadness from like where you guys went in your relationships.
And that time is so short. Like, I remember sitting where you're sitting. I remember sitting in middle school. I remember sitting in high school and thinking, gosh, it's going to be forever until I'm married. Like, I remember thinking that. And yet you blink. And like middle school and high school, it's such a small fragment of your past. And it feels so big and so present right now. And yet, I look back and it's such a small speck of my life. And it goes by so quick. It really does. It's not like you're going to keel over dead before you reach that day.
So I want to close with this. The reality is that we can't make decisions for you. We can't say you have to do this or you cannot do this. But we can ask you the question, what do you believe? And what will you or will you not compromise on? The reality is Bri and I set boundaries and we would not compromise on those boundaries. And so for you guys, you need to be laying down your boundaries now. Not in the heat of the moment, not when all of a sudden you're experiencing the pressure, but in the moments like this where you're not having the pressure. And you need to know what you believe. You need to know what you are not willing to compromise on. And so that kind of leads us into our now whats. Honestly, the now whats are just questions for you guys. They're not statements for you to do, but for you to think about and for you to act on. And so one is what, like for Bri and I, when we originally, before we started dating, we asked this question, what are my boundaries? What do I not want to compromise on? So for me, like one of my boundaries was I'm not going to have sex. And we had other boundaries too. I was pretty extreme. I actually wrote up a contract and gave it to Bri, and she signed it. So like that's just like I kind of look back and I'm like, oh, okay, like
it's kind of one of those things you're like, okay, that was a little awkward.
But
oh well.
I was so passionate about that. I was so passionate about I do not want to compromise on the things I don't want to compromise on. Yeah. And in the same way, Bri also felt that way. She came into it and was like, I have boundaries that I want for my life. And so then once you've determined what are my personal boundaries, then when you are in a relationship, you need to ask, what are the boundaries we have as a couple?
So I'll give an example. When we started dating, like Brad said, we both came into that with boundaries. And we Brad was the one who sat me down day 2 of like being an official couple. And he's like, so what are your boundaries? And I was like, what? I was so uncomfortable. I was like, why are we talking about this? And he's like, no, sit down. We need to talk about these things. And I'm so glad he did.
And I think I'm going to let you finish, but I'm going to say also because I cared so much for her.
Yeah.
Because I cared enough for her that I wanted to know what her boundaries were, so I don't cross them, so that I care about her, so that I am humble enough to care for her in the ways that she needs to be cared for.
And now I'll be honest, when he first asked me, what are your boundaries? The only thing I said was I'm not having sex, because that was the only thing I ever heard of a boundary. Like I only ever heard don't have sex, and that was it. So I was like, well, I'm not supposed to have sex, so that's my boundaries. And he's like, but what about kissing? And I was like, oh, I guess we should talk about that. And he's like, what about holding hands? And I was like, oh, that's probably a boundary too. And he's like, what about if I was to put my hand on your back or on your waist or rub your back or hold, whatever. And it was like he started listing all these things, and I was like, I guess there's more boundaries than just don't have sex. Like, I never thought about that. And so I encourage you to think about it. What are you comfortable with? What are you not comfortable with? And then don't compromise for some of, find out what am I willing to compromise on and what am I not going to compromise on. And make sure that you have that down now, because I promise you there's going to be moments where you are not going to be in a place to make those decisions. And so you need to have already made that decision and be able to just say, this is my answer. So
I want to give an example of how we compromise, because I think that's kind of like
I knew you were going to go there.
Way. So I know that you're kind of going, okay, well then what do you compromise on? Okay, for Bri and I, so I asked her what do you think about kissing? And Bri was like, okay.
It's great now, it's great.
I feel like it's okay. And I was like, okay, I feel the same way. And so we, it was all of a sudden okay, can I kiss you now? And all of a sudden she's like,
Let me just talk about awkward first kiss. When someone goes, so can I kiss you? And you're like, and then to make it even more awkward, my brother walked up right then and was like, I'm not interrupting, am I? And we were like,
well, no,
not
we weren't talking about anything.
So we'll just throw that out there, okay?
But, I mean, in that moment, Bri had never, we had said we liked each other, but we hadn't, officially been a thing at that point. And so, all of a sudden, we went from we're friends, but maybe have some interests, to all of a sudden boyfriend and girlfriend. And Bri, all of a sudden, switching from, I can't like him, to all of a sudden, I can like him.
I'll help explain. Brad was planning on how to ask me out for months, okay? So he had in his head that I was almost his girlfriend, but not his girlfriend yet. Whereas in my brain, it was I can't like him, I'm not dating him, I can't like him. So all of a sudden he's like, finally, I gotta call you my girlfriend. And I was like, wait, I'm your girlfriend now? That was the mental, the mental states that we were in at that point. And so when we had that conversation about boundaries, and Brad's like, so how do you feel about kissing in a dating relationship? All of my siblings in their dating relationships, kissing was fine with certain limitations. And Brad was like, well, I could go either way. I could wait until I'm married to kiss, or I could kiss when I'm dating. And I was like, okay, well, I'm fine with that. And that's when he's like, so can I kiss you now? And then I started to hyperventilate a little bit.
So then, even after that night, we did kiss each other. It was the most awkward kiss
ever. Terrible. It's terrible.
But, I mean,
we've gotten better since then.
But after that moment, I think it was a few days later, Bri all of a sudden came back to me and she said, you know what? Right now, I am so nervous about kissing you that it's not even, enjoyable in this moment.
And so I was so distracted by, is he going to kiss me? Is he going to kiss me? Is he going to kiss me? That I couldn't even enjoy getting to know him and his personality and his character and our relationship dating and getting to go deeper emotionally with each other. And so I finally told him, I'm so anxious about if you're going to kiss me or not. I need to take that anxiety off the table. And so we did. For 6 months, after our first 2-3 kisses, for 6 months we didn't kiss. And I said, you can kiss me on the cheek, but I can't kiss you yet. I need to get to know you better, and I need to take away that anxiety. And so that's what we did. So that was our compromise.
Yeah. So, I mean, you guys got to figure out what are your boundaries that you have as a couple, and then how am I going to hold myself accountable? So I think that's an important thing too, because like Bri said, there's going to be moments that you're going to face where it's going to be really hard to say no. There's going to be moments where you like a person so much that it's I want to say yes in this moment. But you need to have somebody that holds you accountable. And spoiler, it can't be your other person that you're dating. So you can't be oh, you're my accountability partner.
Good luck with that.
But even for me, when I was dating Bri, there were a couple guys that I was really close to that were my age that we held each other accountable. And then I had somebody that was older, an adult, that was holding me accountable. And so I knew in certain moments where I was really feeling man, I really want to take this further. There was moments where I had to hold myself back because I was I know other people are holding me accountable right now. And so you got to have those kind of people in your life.
And find a person that's going to hold you accountable that you can actually talk to about anything. Even if you go further than you want to go, don't keep that to yourself. Go back to that person that's holding you accountable and say, hey, I screwed up. I need better accountability. This is how far I went. Or I had a friend, and during this season, she and I were both dating, different people obviously, but we're both dating, and we were each other's accountability partners. And there was a night that she called me in tears, and she's like, Brianna, I almost did it. I almost went too far. How do I not do that again? And so we slowed it down. We talked it through. We talked about, okay, where were you? She's like, well, I was at his apartment. I'm like, okay. And what were you doing? We were laying on the couch watching a movie. I'm like, okay. Was that a good idea? No, that was a horrible idea. Okay. So find a friend, but then also find an adult that you can talk to and that can help you slow down and think things through. Because it was really helpful to us in those moments.
So I think to wrap it up, here's our final question. Do I believe that sex is worth waiting for? For Bri and I, we made that decision. But now the decision lies in you guys. You're going to experience pressure. The culture is going to tell you it's okay. So now you have to make the decision. Do I believe that what the Bible says is true and that it's true for my life? Or do I believe that culture is right and that's right for my life? You and you only can make that decision. And so we're going to close in prayer. We're going to go into small groups. We don't have a lot of questions tonight in the small groups for this topic. But
You're welcome.
Honestly, I want you guys to continue to think through this question. Not just right now, but as you walk out of this place, as you go back into your communities, whether that be a public school, whether that be homeschool, you are going to have to answer this question. And if it's not right now in high school or in middle school, it's going to be probably in college or in the workforce or whatever. You're going to experience this question.
And answer this question before you're watching a movie on your boyfriend's couch in his apartment or your girlfriend's couch or before you're dropping off your boyfriend or girlfriend in the car at night when it's dark and it's raining and no one can see you. Answer this question before those moments. And be above reproach. I mean, don't live your life in the shadows where people are guessing and you're wondering, did they not? Be transparent about it.
I'm going to say it's also cool to wait. Because that is the reality. It is cool to wait.
It is.
And it's okay to wait.
And it's very okay to wait. And everyone's going to tell you it's not. It is. It doesn't make you weird. It doesn't make you stupid. It doesn't make you fill in the blank. It makes you mature. And it makes you wise to say, you know what, I know the better route here. And I guarantee you, if you do wait, your marriage will look a lot different than your friends' marriages that they didn't wait. So if you guys have further questions or you want to ask deeper questions, but you're like, yeah, maybe not in my small group setting or maybe not here in the middle of everyone sitting here, grab a leader, grab me or Brad. We're more than willing to talk to you guys about it. I mean, if we're going to sit up here and talk to all of you at once about it, we can talk to you one-on-one as well. So if you guys want to know more, if you want to talk about it, if you want to ask questions, we're always here. And not even like tonight, like whenever in life. I mean, Brad and I don't forget our students. I mean, even over the last 5 years, we'll have students from 5 years ago reach out to us and talk to us about something. So we're here for you guys. We love you guys. We care about you guys. And that's why we care enough about you guys to put ourselves in this awkward situation to sit here.
So let me go ahead. I'm going to pray for you guys. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to come before you right now in this conversation. God, this conversation honestly is very important to you because you designed it. You know that it's designed to be something that's great, something that's beautiful. And so, God, I ask that each one of these students here tonight, whether they've already not waited or whether they're still waiting, like wherever they're at, that they would see that now they have a road forward, that they can be able to either say no to the future or I'm going to continue to wait as I've been waiting. And so I ask that you would just help these students to see the importance of this topic, to not shy away from it, to answer this question, and that their lives, that their relationships, that hopefully their marriages would be amazing, and that they would be able to experience, honestly, sex in the ways that it was designed for. And so, God, I care for so much for each one of these students, and I thank you that we can have this conversation, whether it's awkward or not, and to be able to go forward. And so we pray this in your Son's name, Jesus Christ.